Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to this live stream. Well, we finally have a budget that has been tabled, and on this show we've been upping our live streaming capabilities. We're going to be live streaming twice this week. And today I just wanted to have a chat about this budget, how you're feeling about what was tabled, but also think through some of the important ramifications of what Minister Godongwana said. So welcome aboard, like this video, comment down below, because at the end of this video we're also going to be addressing your comments. So this video is going to flow in three parts. First, I just want to set the context so we can bring ourselves up to speed in terms of everything that's happened up to the tabling of the budget speech today. Then I'm going to analyze the budget speech, largely looking at some of the political consequences of what was said, especially around VAT hikes, cuts to some social grants, but also just looking at the dynamics within the GNU, because I think this moment is the start of a very protracted political battle, which is probably going to run all the way to the 1st of July at least, and I'll explain why I think it's going to be that long. Then finally, I'll take some of your comments and we'll interact as well. So this is an interactive SMWX session. By the way, if you're watching on YouTube, also post about this on social media and I'll retweet you. Okay, so let's begin with some of the context. Now, to remember where we came from, on the 19th of February, we were supposed to have a budget speech, and every year we usually get a budget speech around February without much fanfare. But of course, we had that shock announcement that the executive itself hadn't agreed on a budget. The executive went away, they said they'd come back today, and there were various emergency cabinet meetings called to try and get agreement within the executive over this budget. Now, one key thing that emerged in the context and the build-up to today is clearly that there hasn't been agreement within the so-called GNU. And in a few moments, I want to play you a clip from John Steenhuisen, where before the budget speech today, Steenhuisen clearly says that the DA, one of the key partners within this coalition, is not happy with the budget still. So take a look at what John Steenhuisen had to say.
I know that it's been a hectic morning, and we know, and it's been a hectic run up until here. What was the tone in the room, in the cabinet meeting?
I cannot talk about what's happened in the cabinet room. That is bound by cabinet confidentiality. So I cannot get any background on that. What I can, however, say is that the Democratic Alliance will not be supporting the budget in its current form, and therefore the budget being tabled today does not have a parliamentary majority. We obviously put on the table a number of our requirements to stimulate growth and jobs and to move beyond just tax and spend. And those have not been acceded to. We obviously remain open to further discussions before these budget instruments are voted on in Parliament in the coming months. But as the budget sits today, we are not able to support it in its current form.
But it will be tabled?
I've no doubt it will be tabled, but tabling a budget that doesn't have a majority, I don't know what the consequences of that are, but these are consequences that the Finance Minister and others will have to bear.
So this is massive. Remember, the first hurdle is for the executive to table a budget and the executive itself to agree on what that budget should be. And despite weeks, and in fact, before the 19th of February, months of potential time to come to an agreement, the two biggest parties in this coalition still cannot agree on a budget. And quite frankly, I think that represents a massive impasse in this coalition government. If the ANC and the DA are taking weeks and weeks to agree on a budget, can you imagine all the future policy questions that are going to be faced by this government? So I think an era and a period of gridlock is very much upon us. So what I'd like to do from here, having set the context, is then talk about the importance of this budget, what was proposed, and its political implications. So the first thing is to speak about these VAT hikes. Wow, I must say, if stubborn was a government, it would be this one, or maybe a department, which is Treasury, because South Africans have clearly reiterated time and time again that they feel overtaxed. Since this 19th of February, there has been a prolonged public debate where various people, from the Institute of Economic Justice to the SARS commissioner himself, to various economists across the political spectrum, have come out and said there is no necessity to increase VAT, whether by 2%, 1%, 0.5%. And there are creative ways to find revenue within this budget. In particular, the SARS commissioner speaking about if we can increase funding to SARS, then through their capacity to get taxpayer money in, they can actually meet that supposed 58 billion rand shortfall. I had a conversation on this channel with expert economist Duma Qubule, who spoke about the fact that balancing a budget is different when you're talking about a state to when you're talking about a household. And if you're interested in that deeper debate, go and check out that video. But effectively, what has happened here today is that the government has dug its heels in. Yes, it has reduced the VAT proposal, but it has decided to punish all South Africans. VAT hits absolutely everyone, from the poorest person buying a good all the way to the richest person. And government has tried to say that they will be able to cushion this VAT hike proposal by suggesting that there will be zero-rated goods. But the fact of the matter is that has been dispelled and debunked, because even if you try to zero-rate certain consumer goods in the economy, the fact of the matter is that when you increase prices throughout an economy, the inputs to those zero-rated goods can often go up. So what you just get is an indirect price hike. And those zero-rated goods remain more expensive because in the economy, the transportation of those goods, the logistics of getting those goods to market still goes up because the VAT increase goes up. But secondly, a number of goods that are not in the zero-rated basket are consumed by South Africans. So for example, electricity, which is one of the biggest costs, particularly in poor households today in South Africa, has gone up by 30%. And of course, that isn't zero rated. So electricity costs are still hammering the poor in this country who are already in a deep poverty crisis. And so there are just loopholes with this zero rating that mean that at the end of the day, beyond all of the spin, the government has just taken a decision to punish South Africans, to make your life more expensive, and it needs to live and die by that decision. That was the decision that has been taken. Now we can argue about how we got here. I see Minister Godongwana had this very interesting phrase. He said that the cost of living has gone up and the economy has reached a point where we have to make transitions and trade-offs. Now, when politicians use this passive voice, they make it seem as if the economy is this external feature or there was some preordained thing where the economy had to end up like that. What happened is that this government, and particularly the ANC government, failed economically. And because of their failures, the only thing they can think to do now is dig themselves out of that hole by making your taxes higher and by disproportionately affecting the poor through VAT, because of course, since the poor have lower incomes, when you increase VAT, it hits them harder than it hits the rich or even the middle class. So when you hear phrases like the economy has ended up in this situation, or we have found ourselves in this position, what that really means is that this government, and in particular previous ANC governments, and we had the same president in previous governments, the same finance minister, this government has failed to grow the economy, and therefore we are now faced with these invidious choices ahead of us. But what I also found, which was kind of slipped in there, was that some social grants will actually be cut. So what we got was a combination of cuts, particularly to social security, a suggestion that the SRD grant, which has been a lifeline for many people in this economy since COVID, will only be extended for 1 more year. And so there isn't an envisaged expansion of social security concomitantly with this expansion in tax. There's actually a cut to social security and an increase in tax. So if this budget is approved by Parliament, and I'll explain the process because I think that's missing in the public debate after this, what happens from here. If this is approved, the poor are going to be hit the hardest by this. And we can lament the budget itself, but I think this should be a catalyst for a much deeper conversation about the economic failure, both of this coalition government, because growth still remains tepid, and we haven't really got a proper growth target from this government. Is it 3%? But then in the budget, they say it's going to be 0.6% this year. What are we aiming towards? You know, in preparation for this video, I was just looking at some other global examples, and I was looking at Vietnam, one of the world's fastest growing economies. Their government has put their neck on the line this year and said, our goal is 8% growth. If we don't grow by 8%, then we will have failed. And this is how we believe we're going to get to that target. We don't have a specific target in South Africa. It's just cut VAT and inshallah. That's our economic strategy. We don't have, we will grow by this amount. And if we don't grow by this amount, then we have failed. We just have maybe 0.6-ish, but one day 3%, but there's no timeline. And when you have an economy that's just floating along and there's no specific target to which the entire economy should be directed, you get what we have in South Africa, this nebulous non-strategy and then these band-aid solutions. And really we need to talk about the fact that we have been plunged into an economic crisis by, I'm afraid, the ANC. And the ANC still is the core anchor partner in this coalition. They put us in this economic position. And the only thing we can do as citizens is say that, hold them accountable for that, as I'm trying to do now in public, and make them know that we understand that this is their fault. This is not your fault. It's not my fault. We don't run the economy. We are in this situation because we have had misgovernance for too long. We've seen that misgovernance in service delivery, especially in places like Johannesburg, where the president recently discovered that there isn't service delivery. But that misgovernance is also in the economy. And it's getting to the point now where citizens are being squeezed because of that misgovernance. Now, in terms of the politics of this, the first thing to say, as I mentioned earlier, is that the GNU is not agreeing on the budget. And if you can't agree on a budget, that is usually a sign that your coalition is not viable or feasible. The budget is the first hurdle of any coalition. So I would say that this is putting the GNU, so-called, on quite shaky ground, because it's clear that there's an impasse between the DA and the ANC, and both parties have dug in their heels. Now, what that means is that in the public debate, two parties which are supposed to be governing together are now going to be playing the blame game rather than taking their share of responsibility for government decisions. But to truly understand the politics of this moment, we need to look at the intersection of politics and law, because there are various acts which bring together what will happen from now. And we are just at the beginning of this process, not at the end. So let me tell you what is about to unfold. And at each stage, you will see that there is a potential political roadblock that could mean that we are in for months and months of political gridlock concerning this budget. So today, the budget speech is when the government tables a budget, and that means that simultaneously the Treasury and the Cabinet put a proposal down for two things, what is called the Division of Revenue Bill and the Appropriation Bill. And those are two separate ways that we take all the money that we get as a country and then divide it. Now, the Division of Revenue Bill is about how much money goes to the different spheres of government. And the Appropriations Bill is about how much money goes to different national government departments. So when Minister Godongwana takes to the stage today and says, we are allocating this amount to defense, what he's really saying is our proposal for the increase in defense spending is this amount. It doesn't mean it's going to happen yet. So what happens from here is, as he proposes those two simultaneous propositions, he then will submit that to Parliament, and Parliament will immediately give that to its committees. Now, as you may know, there are actually two houses of Parliament, the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. And each of those have their own finance committee. So when Minister Godongwana gives his budget speech, he then effectively hands it over to the finance committees of both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. And those committees are tasked with looking at in more depth at this fiscal framework, and within 16 days, conducting public consultations. So you, as a citizen of South Africa, have an opportunity now in the public consultations that will happen in the finance committees to make your voice heard. And all of those different political party representations and public representations will then go to these committees, and they will consider whether to amend the budget that has been proposed or to keep it as it is. Now, as you can see, those of you with your political hats on will be starting to realize that what happens if those committees do not agree on what amendments need to be made? The ANC doesn't have a majority in those committees. So technically, opposition parties could come together to reject this and propose amendments over the head of the ANC. And there's nothing the ANC can do if opposition parties unite in those committees. But let's assume, for example, that, okay, those committees propose amendments that are agreed to, or they don't have any amendments. That's still not the end of the process. Because after that process, we then get the National Assembly once again adopting the fiscal framework. And then there are two bills. Just as in the budget speech, there are kind of two simultaneous proposals going on. So then there's the Division of Revenue Bill, which has to be decided in the Appropriations Committee. And that is how much money should go to each of the provinces. And that Division of Revenue Bill has to be discussed 35 days after today's budget speech. So there is another potential political headache. Because even if the fiscal framework is agreed to and the finance committees agree after those public consultations, then the appropriations committee is going to look at the division of revenue. They too have to go to public consultation. And Musi Maimane chairs that committee, I believe, in Parliament at least, in the National Assembly. And then they will have to decide on the division of revenue. Now, let's assume that we get agreement, and again, the ANC is not the majority in that committee. Let's assume we get agreement on the division of revenue. Then, and only then, can you talk about the appropriations bill. And then the appropriations bill has to be passed by Parliament as a whole. And according to legislation, particularly, I think it's the Money Amendment Act. According to legislation, Parliament has 4 months after the start of the financial year for all of these things to happen. Now, the financial year in South Africa starts on the 1st of March, I believe. So from the 1st of March, we have until the 1st of July for all of these parliamentary processes to happen, and for Parliament itself then to approve the Division of Revenue Bill as well as the Appropriation Bill. Now, again, it could go to the National Assembly and be voted down. So we are in uncharted territory here because the ANC desperately needs partners to agree to these proposals. We already know that the DA is out. So the ANC has a couple of options. They could try and get all the small parties together. But we know that the ANC plus the small parties in the GNU don't quite get to 50% of the votes. So would they try and bring other smaller parties who are outside the GNU? We already know Action SA has voted against or has come out against this budget. So the ANC isn't going to get there, I don't think, by small parties, which means they need one of the bigger parties. So are they going to try and bring the EFF on side? I think it would be suicidal for the EFF to agree to these VAT increases. But on the other hand, they may then replace the DA within the government of national unity if this impasse continues. Will the ANC try to bring MK on board? I doubt that's going to happen either. So the ANC is in a difficult position to the extent that it could be isolated if all opposition parties unite against this budget. At the same time, there'll be a countervailing pressure, though, because South Africans need a budget. We actually need a budget. There are exceptional mechanisms where I think 45% of last year's revenue can be passed automatically, but ultimately, the longer things go, the more we'll need a budget. And remember, in parallel to all of this, the departments also need to be voting on and debating their own budgets. So we've got a lot to focus on ahead. Musi Maimane is going to be a very important politician because chairing that National Assembly committee is an important place now because we don't have any party with a single majority. The likes of Songezo Zibi and all the chairpersons, there are some ANC chairpersons of the finance committees. So Mr. Masanganwi, I believe, is one of them. So we are in a difficult place politically. The ANC has just put up what I think will be quite an unpopular budget. And now we need to see whether political parties will join the ANC in forwarding this. Bear in mind, this comes at a time just before a local government election when political parties will be punished for the decisions they make. And so the ANC must be very brave at this point to propose a budget like this when South Africans will be issuing a democratic verdict on its governance in 18 months or so. So that's what you can expect to go forward from here. And those are some of the political pitfalls to wrap your mind around as we try to make sense of this budget. Bear in mind, I'm doing it literally as the budget speech has ended. So we're trying to think through this live together. And if there are any facts that I've left out or that you need to check me on, do so in the comments below. And now I'd like to move to the interactive portion of our conversation. So our producer, Oratile, is waiting off camera but on mic to give me some questions. We've asked for some of your questions on X. We've asked for some of your questions. Comment down below, and I'll try to take as many of them as I can, and then we will wrap up the show. So let's take some of your questions.
So I'll start off with comments, Sizwe.
Cool.
On YouTube, Fanam Lawuli says, so angry about the VAT increase. How are we supposed to live under these very difficult conditions? Just disgusted. On Twitter, Brian Leggett says, ECD subsidy reaching 700,000 more children is the best budget news ever. On YouTube, MVDM says it's like the ANC wants us to hate them and vote them out. And then the last comment on YouTube says, if the ANC does to you what the apartheid government did to you, then you must do to the ANC what you did to the apartheid government.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela, the time is now. And then just some reactions while we were shooting.
Shall we stop there? I'll respond to those, and then we can.
sure.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Oratile, for collating those. So, as I expected, I mean, I don't know what the public reaction is yet because we've been preparing for this show, but a lot of disaffection about the VAT increase, and people just can't believe that the ANC has still decided to go ahead with this. But like I said, those in government become tone deaf. Something happens. I've watched it so many times. You have a radical, interesting ANC leader, and they talk about being there for the people. And then they get into government, and I'm telling you, within like 3 months, their rhetoric changes. Suddenly we get told about hard choices, and so that's where we are. In terms of Brian's comment, I agree. ECD is one of the key building blocks of our economy in the long term. I know there's been a lot of work around the formalization of ECD centers. Shout out to my wife and partner, Sumaya Hendricks, who did a lot of work in that space with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And it's good to see that there's going to be more funding there. So yes, in fairness, there were some moves to try and cushion the poor and focus on a more developmental agenda. Another one which I would highlight is the work that was done around funding of public transport so that people can finally travel from their homes to places of work at lower cost. But this should have been done a long time ago, and these are ultimately just band-aids on a deeper wound, I fear. Cool. All right, Dile, thanks a lot. Shall we come back to some more reactions?
Yeah, some reactions while we started the stream. Julius Malema coming out of Parliament there saying they will not support any form of increase in VAT, which comes to a lot of questions that people are asking around whether the possibility of the EFF working with the ANC to pass this budget if the DA doesn't support it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I mean, I think that's the right thing from Julius Malema to say, because I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on the EFF right now to say, give us your votes, trade your votes for power. But the EFF is doing the right thing, in my view, by putting the ball back in the ANC's court and saying, well, this is your budget. It seems some of your partners don't agree. Explain to South Africans why you think this is a good idea. So very interesting to see Julius Malema already coming out against this VAT increase and rejecting it. And you can bet then that those votes in Parliament will not be behind this. So I just wonder, where does the ANC get these votes? And which small party or which opposition party is willing to put its head on the chopping block ahead of a local government election to say, we agree in a VAT increase? Any other reactions?
I think we can go to the questions around the grants. The grants have been increased, as you'll see on screen now. The various war veterans grants, old age grants, disability grants have been increased. The question there is, will the increase of grants cushion this VAT increase by any chance?
Yeah, so I must look at the grants thing in a bit more detail, and it probably requires a more detailed look. But from what I could tell listening to the speech, the increase in the grants is not the same increase that people were expecting in many cases. So I think it could have been the old age grant went up by 150 in a previous speech, but it's only 130 now, or there's some kind of 20 Rand shortfall there. So even when we're talking about increases, you've got to think about whether those increases are what is expected and whether they are inflationary. I'm not so sure what they are right now, but it did seem to me that certain forms of social security are, if not being cut, are not being increased at the same level. And then, of course, you have this idea of the SRD grant. Now, there have been proposals to expand this into a basic income grant. Clearly, it seems to me that Treasury and the ANC are not in favor of this. And in fact, they kind of want to curtail it. So they decided not to curtail it this year, but they've said we're extending it by 1 year. Now, they've been saying they're extending it by 1 year every year. But at some point, a decision is going to have to be made policy-wise. Is this thing going to stay on indefinitely or for a longer time, or will it actually be cut? So in terms of the trade-off, I don't see how the grant increases trade off the VAT increases. Because Social Security, let's really think about this. You know, if you're receiving an SRD grant in and of the region of between 350 and 400, that's not enough, even in terms of the upper bound poverty line to get you through your daily expenses. Now, if a few cents are taken off bread, or if the VAT or bread stays the same, but you just don't get the VAT increase hit, I don't see how that's really going to help lift people out of poverty and create this kind of cushion, so to speak. But maybe it's fodder for another interview, because we really would need to go into the details and chop up exactly the different increases in Social Security and how they affect people's budgets in terms of inflation. Shall we maybe take one or two other or maybe one last reaction, and then we can close this out?
Yeah. We'll take one more question on YouTube. They say, can centralized government spending help ordinary South Africans, or is it time for radical privatization to create jobs?
I'm not so sure about these proposals of radical privatization. It sounds to me like just the opposite side of the coin of saying that the state should own everything. If you really look empirically at the great economies of the last century or the last half century, what you'll see is that they have a mixture of state ownership and privatization. So the question for me is not so much whether South Africa should privatize everything or whether everything should be publicly owned. The question is, what is the right mix of public and private ownership, and what is the correct timing in which to slightly shift that mix? Now, I'm perfectly open to suggestions that certain things should be privatized. I'm not sure that everything that's currently state-owned should be state-owned. And I think if you privatize, for example, some state-owned enterprises, that could free up capital to have state participation in the economy in other more important places. I've spoken at length about the state property portfolio and how we need to sweat that as an asset and use that to our benefit as a country. But so I don't think we should be dogmatic about privatizing or public ownership. The question is what mix and at what time. But unfortunately, what we have now is just a stagnant policy. The same things must be publicly owned. The same things must be privately owned. And it takes like 5 years for like a minor tweak. Whereas what we really need is fast-moving government, which tries something different. And I just feel that in this coalition setting, rather than getting the swift changes we need, we're just going to get gridlock and prolonged debate about what really needs to change. Are there any political reactions or anything that's been said by the parties before we close out around the budget? I know often straight afterwards people come out of parliament and say things. So I'm wondering if MK has said anything, wondering if maybe Freedom Front or anyone on that side has said anything yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, before the budget was delivered, the Freedom Front Plus did say that they would also not be supporting any form of VAT increase. Vuyo Zungula has also tweeted an increase in electricity prices, increase in fuel cost, increase in cost of living, to top it off, increase in VAT. South Africans, we have to act.
Sure. I think Zungula is spot on there. And so is the Freedom Front Plus, quite frankly. So clearly within the GNU then, to conclude, we know Freedom Front is not behind this. We know DA is not behind this. So who is behind? Is Patriotic Alliance behind the VAT increase? We need to hear from them. Is Rise Mzansi behind this increase? Are BOSA behind the increase? Is the IFP behind the increase? Or is this just an ANC decision to say, we're tabling a budget and we'll see what happens down the road. So interesting. And I think, wow, Vuyo Zungula's tweet is right. Electricity prices, fuel prices, now VAT. South Africans are suffering because of chronic misgovernment. And we had a change election last year, and yet nothing has changed. That I find interesting about our country. Voters said something needs to change. And then we have a government that's like, well, we're going to keep everything the same, except make everything more expensive. I don't see how that's sustainable. Last reaction, and then we'll close this video out. Thank you for liking and subscribing and being here.
Yeah, we'll close it off. Ziyanda Ngobo with Newsroom Africa spoke with the president after the budget. And he also just said it took a lot of discussions, a lot of talking to each other with various parties, and it came to this. In the end, the minister was faced with a lot of challenges and difficulties on how to balance the budget.
Typical President Ramaphosa. My view is that the president's chief role in our society is to prevent people from getting angry. Just make people think something is going to happen somewhere down the line, tell people that they thought carefully about this, pretend to be shocked when things go wrong. And I must say he's brilliant at it, because people have a lot to be concerned about, and yet the president has a way of making you feel like one day in the distant future, if you just keep holding on, things will change. But we're nearly 8 years into this presidential term of Cyril Ramaphosa, and the numbers just don't back up his reassurances. And so I think the position I'm in right now is I would love to get behind any government, but I'm only going to do it when I see the data to back it up. And right now, from a budget perspective, from a growth perspective, from an unemployment perspective, from a governance perspective, from an unemployment and inequality perspective, from a crime perspective, we just aren't seeing change. And my worry is that politicians in parliament are going to be debating while people's lives continue to get worse. And that is the crisis that we all in South Africa need to come together to resolve. And I believe we can do that, but we need to make our voices heard. We need to make politicians less comfortable, and we need to propose creative and innovative solutions to our country's problems. And we have the minds, we have the brilliance to do that. So we'll end on a note of hope that it's in our hands in this democracy to shift gears and drive ourselves out of this position. Thank you. Hope you enjoy. What do you think about these new prototype SMWX caps? Yay or nay? If you think we should do it, then we'll add these to the merch list. Get yourself an SMWX hoodie. Become a member of this channel so you can get access to conversations and dinners with me in person, also exclusive content, and help us reach 250,000 subscribers. How many people watched while we were live, by the way?
Nearly 14,000.
14,000 people watched this while we streamed live. Okay, that's pretty crazy. We are the new TV. And the reason that is because you have supported this channel. You spread the fire. When we start videos, we say spread the fire. If you're new around here, that is not a literal injunction. We are just saying this channel grows by word of mouth, and it always has. So when you become a viewer for the first time, you then become a fire spreader. So tell this channel to your friends, share it, and help spread the fire, because we're growing an organic alternative to mainstream media, which is informed, which is educational, and which is hopefully enlightening. So thank you for joining us on SMWX. I'm Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and we hope to see you on the next one. Aye.